Rainbow trout may not be as tough to catch as brown trout, but they're known for their exciting jumps and growing to look more like a football than a fish. This week on Untangled, you'll learn all the quirks and family secrets of rainbow trout, what they like to eat, where they like to live, and how they behave during a hatch. This will help you have a much better chance at putting a really nice one in the net.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. You know, rainbow trout are interesting. They're interesting little critters because they're kind of like the dogs of the fly fishing world in a way. They're everywhere. They're in every single state, even Hawaii. You can go to Hawaii and catch rainbow trout. So they're a lot like dogs that way because dogs are literally everywhere, right? But since there's so many of them, sometimes it takes a really special one to remind you of just how amazing they are, right? I see this a lot, actually, because my wife's a dog groomer. So we get to see a lot of dogs on a pretty consistent basis and, you know, wide range of them and whatnot. And over time, you kind of become desensitized to it. You don't really appreciate them. And then a really great dog is going to come along, a show dog or something that we get to groom, and you fall in love with it all over again. You're looking at it and it's so cute, or it's just got the best personality and you're just happy to see it. And it reminds you, oh yeah, this is why I love dogs. Well, rainbow trout are the same way. They really are. It takes a really great one sometimes to remind you why you love them so much, but they are that special and they are that cool. And hopefully, after learning a little bit more about rainbows, which you'll do today, you'll see them in that light. You'll appreciate them a little bit more. And then, of course, you're going to leave this episode with a ton of knowledge that you can use to help you catch either more rainbows or bigger rainbows, or I guess if you're feeling real greedy, you can catch a little bit of both. You can catch more big rainbows after you're done listening to today's show. So let's start things off by looking at a little bit of their life history, and then we'll dive into some of the tactics for catching rainbow trout. So rainbows are native to the rivers that drain into the Pacific Ocean, and that native range includes everywhere from the Alaska Range of mountains, which runs east-west across kind of south-central Alaska, if you look at the map. So from there, all the way down through Canada's west coast, America's west coast, and then all the way down actually into Baja California in Mexico. They're native through that entire area. And then on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, they are native to the Amur River drainage in Russia, and then north all the way to Kamchatka, which is this little peninsula, really remote Russian peninsula that actually has some of the best rainbow trout fishing in the world. And it is on my list of places to get to after I've caught my taimen and my tiger fish and my Arctic char. I want to go there. So, for our purposes here in North America, if a river drains into the Pacific Ocean eventually, then it is part of the rainbow trout's historic native range. That means originally, before we started putting fish in all sorts of different places across the country, rainbow trout were found throughout most of California, all of Washington and Oregon, and then parts of Idaho, and even a tiny sliver. The biologists are pretty certain there's a tiny sliver of Montana where they're native to as well. Now, they're not native to anywhere else in America, so even though you can catch them elsewhere, they're not native there. We've been putting them in hatcheries across the country for over, I think we're close to 150 years. We'll get to that date in a minute. But we've been cultivating rainbows for a long time, and that's one of the unique things about rainbow trout is they do very well in hatcheries, a lot more so than other trout species, which is why rainbows get stocked so frequently across so many different places. Rainbows will do great in just a wide variety of habitats, like they do very well in the low elevation spring creeks out in the driftless area in the Midwest. But then you come out here to the Rockies, we've got some higher elevation streams, and they'll do great here. And in fact, they'll even be found a little bit higher in a lot of our streams here in the Rockies than the brown trout will be. And that's because of how rainbow trout evolved. If you look at the rivers and the places where rainbow trout grew up, they're very swift, they're very highly oxygenated, The water temps in those rivers tend to be a lot cooler than a lot of the rivers and streams that brown trout evolved in. We actually did an episode like this, so I guess this is probably like our second one in the series, but we did a deep dive into brown trout as well. And I'll throw a link to that in the show notes if you're interested in learning about brown trout. But getting back to our rainbows, they will hang out in the faster water that's more highly oxygenated, and they'll go a little bit higher in the systems because they want that cooler water, because that's what they evolved in. That's how rainbow trout, as we know them today, came to be, is through who knows how many thousands of years of swimming around in those really swift streams that are draining right into the Pacific Ocean. And then, just in case you're not aware, because I did mention hatcheries just a second ago, hatcheries are used to raise trout from an egg. They usually get them at the egg point, and then they'll hatch them, hence the name hatchery, often to a juvenile stage. So they'll grow that fish. It can really depend the size. Usually you're looking like between 3 to 9 inches, depending on the hatcheries. Some can grow them a little bit bigger. Some will grow them smaller. But they'll grow them to about a juvenile stage, and then they are taken out of those hatcheries, loaded onto trucks, and stocked into rivers and lakes for us to catch. And then in a lot of places, they're also stocked for harvest. Rainbow trout are really popular to eat, not just here in America, but across the world. So that's just your 2 cents there on hatcheries. But rainbow trout, they will vary a ton in appearance. When they're fresh from that hatchery, they're usually pale. They're kind of silvery. They don't have a lot of color to them. The wild fish, the ones that have been living out of the hatchery for a while, will tend to be darker, but they'll all have a green back. They'll have black spots scattered across the body, and then some sort of colored stripe that goes all the way from their gill plate down to almost the tail. And that stripe can be purple, it can be red, orange, a combination of those colors. I've seen a little bit of yellow in there sometimes. That's where they get their rainbow nickname from, is the combination of the green and the black and the silver, and then that big red, purple stripe down the middle. You look at them, it's easy to see why somebody looked at that and thought, it looks like a rainbow. We're going to call that the rainbow trout. So that's what they look like. Now, some of them, and this is really interesting, some rainbow trout have the ability to become anadromous, which is a fancy word that just means that they migrate from freshwater out to the ocean. So they will be born in freshwater, they grow up, and then they'll go and live in the ocean for a few years. And then they come back to freshwater to spawn, just like salmon do. Okay, salmon do that same thing. This is where, when they're out in the ocean, this is where they learn their secret rainbow trout tricks for not ending up like food for killer whales, because they've got to make it back to spawn. So they've got to dodge whales, and sea lions eat fish, I think, right? It's either them or walruses. One, I can't remember. Maybe both of them do. But they got to dodge all of those things, right? To get back. And these ocean-going forms of rainbow trout, the ones that leave freshwater and go live in the ocean for a few years and come back, these are known as steelhead. And steelhead and rainbow trout, they're not separate species. There is a lot of science that goes into this, but steelhead are basically just rainbow trout with the genetic impetus to head to the ocean for a few years. There's some genetic trigger somewhere in their DNA that tells them, hey, go out to the ocean, eat a bunch of food, get really big and strong, come back and pass those big, strong genes on to the next generation of fish. Again, they're literally the same species, rainbows and steelheads, but some of them just, they've got the capacity to get out of the little town they grew up in and head to the big city and grab the world by the tail and put it in their pocket, as the late, great Chris Farley used to say. So steelhead are really cool. There's a huge culture around catching and fishing steelhead up in the Pacific Northwest. Folks love to get into them. And there's a lot of issues facing steelhead right now from population problems. There's just not very many of them left. So there's a lot of issues there. I'm not going to dig into them on this show, but you can read up on those if you want. There is no real recognized record for the largest steelhead ever caught. I tried to find a consensus on that, and I couldn't find anything that was legitimately, this is the biggest steelhead ever caught. But I did find some stories about steelhead weighing up to 55 pounds. Yeah, you heard that right. 55 pounds. A rainbow that can grow to 55 pounds. All right, that's a hefty fish. That's a fish that enjoys the buffalo wings every day. But that big, it goes out to the ocean, it doesn't die, and then it comes back to freshwater and spawns, and you can catch it in a river. That's a pretty stinking awesome fish. It's easy to see why folks get so amped about steelhead. They're just pretty cool. The current world record rainbow trout, though, there is a record for just all rainbow trout, is a 48-pound fish that was caught from Lake Diefenbacher in Canada back in 2009. And there's actually quite a bit of debate about this fish because it was actually a triploid rainbow. And a triploid rainbow has 3 sets of chromosomes instead of 2. And that makes them sterile, so they can't produce more fish. But it also makes them grow a lot larger, a lot quicker. Now, triploid rainbows can only be created in hatcheries, and they're often created in hatcheries, and then they're stocked in different fisheries to provide a fast-growing fish for anglers. But then also, if you're stocking sterile fish in, you can kind of control the trout population so that they don't get too out of control. So there's a couple of reasons why triploid rainbows get created. But some folks say, well, that 48-pounder shouldn't count because it wasn't a wild, regular fish. It was engineered in a lab, and then it escaped from its hatchery and just grew huge. So there is some controversy around that. I still think it's pretty cool to see a 48-pound rainbow trout. I'm not going to lie. That's a pretty cool stinking fish. Rainbows can be pretty aggressive, a little bit more aggressive than I think they're given credit for. We talk about brown trout and bull trout being very aggressive predators, but rainbows can be as well. They're certainly more aggressive than the cutthroat and the grayling, which are native to a lot of the Rocky Mountains. Now, those are the only native salmonids, I believe, the fish from the salmon family native to the Rockies is our cutthroat and then our grayling. Those were it. And when rainbows started getting planted in the rest of America, it was about the mid-1870s when we started seeing rainbows being plucked from California, where they were native. I believe it was on the McCloud River, where a lot of the first hatchery efforts began, and then they were shipped all across the country in the mid-1870s. But once they ended up here in the Rockies, they really started to outcompete all of our native cutthroat and our native grayling. They're just more aggressive predators, and the cutthroat and the graylings never grew up together, or grew up with a predator like the rainbow trout around, so they didn't really know how to handle it, and the rainbows just came in, kind of took over, and they're a big reason why a lot of our cutthroat populations are so low now compared to what they were 100 years ago. And that's also not helped by the fact that rainbow and cutthroat trout can also breed together. They create this fertile hybrid called a cutbow, and then that further dilutes both your native cutthroat genetics and then the native rainbow trout genetics too. So you lose some of that genetic purity that's important for maintaining healthy populations of wild animals out there on the landscape. Rainbows pose a big enough threat to cutthroat in some places that they're being forcibly removed. A good example of that's the Snake River, the South Fork of the Snake in Idaho. Idaho Fish and Game is still trying to remove rainbows and browns and to make that a cutthroat and whitefish only fishery. We'll see if they succeed with that, but they've been working on that for a lot of years now. Rainbows, most of them will spawn in the spring, but a few strains, a few odd branches off the family tree, they will spawn in the fall. And actually going down that little rabbit hole, there's tons of strains of rainbow trout. And what a strain is, you can think of it, it's like a different type. It's kind of like the difference between the Rocky Mountain elk that we have here in the Rockies and then the Roosevelt elk that's on the West Coast. They're both elk, but the Roosevelt elk grow a little bit smaller. The Rocky Mountain elk grow a little bit bigger. Same thing for mule deer and whitetail deer. They're both deer, but they've got some pretty distinct differences in how big they grow and what their antlers look like. Well, it's the same thing with different strains of rainbow trout. They're still rainbow trout, but they change a little bit. Kamloops rainbows would be an example of a strain that a lot of folks have heard of. And Kamloops rainbows are often viewed as the largest, some of the best fighting of all the rainbow trout strains. And they've evolved. They grew up in maybe isolated pockets or different lakes or remote rivers, and they grew a little bit differently than other rainbow trout and got some genetics that helped them survive in their environment. And that's how these strains come to be. And rainbows, no matter what strain you're catching, they do have a reputation for jumping and giving you a great show when you hook into them. That's largely true in my experience. I very rarely have a rainbow fail to put on a good show when I hook into it, especially the big ones. They're kind of cool. And then Columbia River red band and Great Basin red band trout, if you've heard of those two species, they are subspecies of rainbow trout. So that's where they belong in the trout family. The rainbow trout's scientific name, and I'm going to try really hard to not butcher this, is Oncorhynchus micus, which is, I don't know, right? You never knew that when you signed up for fly fishing, you were also signing up for a crash course in Latin, but their scientific name is important, okay? Because scientific name goes genus, species, right? Genus is Oncorhynchus, species is Micus. But that Oncorhynchus genus is the same genus as cutthroat, which are Oncorhynchus clarkii, Apache trout, which are Oncorhynchus apache, and I'm butchering the pronunciation. But then it's also the same species or genus, as pink salmon, chum salmon, coho salmon, sockeye salmon, and king salmon. So rainbow trout, cutthroat trout, Apache trout, and all the Pacific salmon are basically cousins, which I think is actually a pretty cool little tidbit of knowledge. And then again, the Columbia River red band and the Great Basin red band trout also fall into that tree as well. And then last little bit about their life history. Rainbows are going to live about 4 to 6 years in the wild, pretty similar to a lot of other trout. Steelhead can live for up to 11 years in the wild, though, which is pretty stinking cool, especially since they can spawn multiple times. They're not like salmon where they die after spawning. The steelhead can go back to the ocean, get big and strong again, and then come back and spawn again, which I think is pretty stinking cool. All right, so we know a little bit more about the rainbow trout now. Let's talk a little bit about how to catch them, some tips and tactics and whatnot for it. And the first one to keep in mind is the type of water where you're most likely to find rainbows. Now, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's worth revisiting here. Rainbow trout are going to prefer fast, highly oxygenated water, and they do best in rivers where the average high temperature doesn't get much above 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Since their life history involves so much migration, I mean, look at steelhead. They will migrate all the way from the Pacific Ocean to Stanley, Idaho, which I think is 900 something miles that they'll swim up the river. They'll do that. They'll migrate that long distance just to spawn. So since there's so much migration in the life history of rainbow trout, they will move around a lot in rivers. That's something to keep in mind. They'll be able to find good habitat just about anywhere, so long as the water is clear and cold, but they really love the high gradient, a little bit quicker sections of the rivers than other trout do. Because again, if you look at where the rainbows evolved, that makes sense. A lot of the rivers that they evolved in are high gradient. They come straight from the mountains and just drain right into the ocean. There's usually not this big wide valley that they're going through. It's just very fast, very steep water. So whenever they're planted somewhere else, their genetics kick in and makes them seek out that sort of habitat. And you'll see this in rivers where you've got, let's say there's rainbows, there's browns, maybe there's cutthroat in there, there's some other fish. The rainbows will very often congregate in certain pieces of water because that's the water they feel most comfortable in. The faster riffles, the very quick pockets, they will hold in really quick pocket water. The speedy runs, those are all of the places that rainbow trout will gravitate towards. And you've got a much higher chance of catching them in water like that than the deep, slow runs that brown trout prefer. And just a quick story to put this in perspective. On one of my favorite rivers that Alex and I fish pretty often, there's a spot we call the Rainbow Run, because my biggest rainbow trout I've ever caught, it is my biggest, it was a 25-inch fish. I caught that from this run. And it consistently produces just giant rainbows. We've caught some cutthroat in there, and we've caught, I think, like 2 brown trout in the years that we fished this spot. But we're mostly catching big rainbows out of it. And that's because it is a very fast riffle that drops into a deep run, but it is a lot more swift. It's very highly oxygenated than a lot of the water around it. There's a lot of slower kind of meh water around it that the brown trout love, because that's what they grew up in. But the rainbows congregate in this rainbow run, and you will almost consistently catch more rainbows out of stuff like that. And then on this same river, there's browns and cutthroat in it as well. There's different types of water you target for the brown trout because it's more likely they're going to hold there than they are in the stuff that the rainbows love. So you do see that out in the real world. It's not just a concept I talk about on the podcast. Rainbows don't love or dislike structure more than any other trout. They'll take advantage of it when it's there, but they're not like brown trout where they actively seek out the nastiest, gnarliest root ball to hang out behind so that they can take your fly, go down there, break it off, and laugh at you. They're not doing that. They'll break it off when they jump, or they'll just run you out of fly line. But they usually aren't mean the way that brown trout are. And now let's round this out with some flies and a couple more tactics as well for catching these fish. Now, rainbows are awesome because even when they get big, they still tend to eat a pretty balanced diet. Brown trout, when they start to get big, when they start to get older, they get a lot more piscivorous, which means they eat mostly other fish. Rainbow trout, however, they'll still eat a lot of aquatic insects when they're big. And then they'll go for streamers, they'll eat other fish, but they'll have that balanced diet where they'll eat a lot of aquatic insects. Again, my personal best rainbow was 25 inches, and I caught it on a size 18 zebra midge. And then Alex's personal best rainbow was a 25.25-inch fish that he caught on a size 18 demon midge. So 2 really, really nice trout, both of them on tiny midges. You kind of defies a lot of the stuff we hear about, oh, got to do big flies for big fish. Well, rainbows will still take advantage of a meal that's hitting them in the face. If you prefer to fish streamers, you definitely can use streamers to chase rainbows. You stand a good chance at catching a big rainbow trout. But if you prefer fishing dry droppers or you really like throwing nymph rigs, then you've honestly got a pretty good chance at catching a really big rainbow too, in my experience. My best rainbow came on a nymph rig. It wasn't on a dry dropper. I caught a really nice rainbow last year on a streamer. I've caught some big rainbows on dry flies. Like, they've eaten everything, whereas most of my better brown trout have all come off the streamer. That's just how they act. One thing I do want to address here is that rainbow trout are still opportunistic predators. So this means that you don't need to look for rainbow trout flies. This is a question I see sometimes. Folks will write in and say, all I'm catching are brown trout. I want to catch rainbows. What flies do I use? Well, it's not really about the flies. It can be, but it's less about the flies and way more about where you're fishing. So if you want to target rainbows and they're in a river that has other trout in it, then you need to look for those faster riffles, those faster runs, the pocket water that's moving quickly, because the rainbows are going to tend to hang out in that a lot more than any other fish, and that's going to up your chances of it. It's not really fly dependent, okay? You want your fly selection to match the aquatic insects that are available for the fish to eat, and if you do that, you'll be in shape to catch plenty of fish, rainbows included. And then finally, rainbows also have a reputation for eating mice in broad daylight, which is something you'll really only see a lot of in Alaska or Russia. And that's largely because they've got such a short growing season. That far north, they need to be aggressive to get big and last through the winter because they're under ice most of the year. But I bring that up just to reiterate the fact that rainbows are still aggressive. They're still opportunistic predators. I've seen friends catch rainbows on mouse flies at night when they've been mousing for big browns. Sometimes where you'll catch big rainbow will surprise you. But hopefully you'll learn something new, and hopefully you'll learn a tidbit or two that will help you go out there and be more successful with rainbows here as fishing season really gets underway. And if there's anything about rainbow trout you'd like some more information on, or you want me to explain a little bit more of it, please drop a comment. I'd love to help you out with that. But don't go anywhere, folks, because even though we are done with the open of the show, we've still got a lot more, and the Q&A section is coming up next.
Nothing is worse than hooking into a big fish only to have your knot break halfway through the fight. Setting up your rod and tying knots can be confusing and frustrating, especially if you're unsure if it's going to work. That's why we put together our Rigs and Knots Pocket Guide. It has instructions and tips on how to set up the most time-tested, proven, reliable fly fishing rigs step by step. So if you want to spend less time tinkering and more time fishing with confidence, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this guide for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week here on Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like you. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, go ahead and send that in. There's a link to do so in the show notes. And often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the open of the show as well. So you never know how your question's going to get used. But definitely keep those coming. I love getting them from you guys. And our first question this week comes to us from Chris from Missouri. Writes in and says, "We're traveling to Washington State next year for vacation and fishing. What's the best way to find someone there that can give us info on locations and equipment for various fish species? I'm very new to fly fishing and excited to try fly fishing out west. We want to make the best out of this trip since we've never been there. Thank you." Chris, this is a good question. I hope y'all have a good time in Washington. I've fished a little bit up there. There's some interesting fisheries up there, really cool stuff. And you've got really two options here. Your first option is you can just go ahead and throw into Google, just Google places to fish near where you're staying, places to fly fish near where you're going to be. Let's use Yakima as an example. I've been up there most recently. So if you Googled places to fly fish near Yakima, you're going to find a bunch of information online about where to fish, how to fish, what flies to use. There'll be somebody that's written something about it, so there'll be some information online. And this will give you a really broad idea of the fishing options that are in the area. And it can also help you zero in on the areas that are more likely to offer the kind of fishing you're looking for. If it's trout, or if you want to go after steelhead, if you're looking for pike or bass or whatever it is, you can use this process to kind of narrow down what your options are. Now, that's a good way to do it. But the other option, and this is what I do most of the time, is I just call fly shops in the area of where I'm going to be. Out here in the West, we're lucky. There's a lot of fly shops, and they've got a really good pulse on a lot of the fishing. Fly shops are usually going to give you a bit more precise information than what you will find online, unless it's like, go back to that Yakima example. There's a lot on the Yakima River. It's a great little fishery up there. No kind of secret. There's a lot of stuff online about it. Fly shops can still give you very current information on it, but if you're tucked away in a more out of the way spot, for example, the fly shops will usually give you more precise information on a lot of those fisheries. And I like the up-to-date current reports on what's going on. That's the method that I like to use. And then when I get up there, when I've made my trip, I'll go into the fly shops that I called. I'll buy some flies. I'll maybe grab a hat. I'll get some more floating or split shot, whatever terminal tackle I'm out of. I'll go buy it from them just as a thank you for pointing me in the right direction. I like talking to folks and asking questions though, so I will call fly shops a lot more because of that. And then there's also a little video we put together that goes even more into detail on exactly how Alex and I find places to fish. It goes down exactly, how to figure out if a place is going to be great or not, how to find new places to fish wherever you're going, if that's just local to you, or if you're like Chris and you're traveling. I'll throw a link to that video in the show notes. You can go check it out if you're interested. And I hope that answers your question, Chris. Thanks for sending it in. Jordan from Utah writes in and says, "Hey Spencer, I have recently decided to bring my fly tying ability up to par with my fishing ability. I'm curious what resources you know of for learning new patterns and needed materials. I've gone through some of the masterclass videos through Ventures on YouTube, but would like more than one source. Thanks for all you do." Jordan, that's a good question. And I'm glad you enjoyed the masterclasses, the tying masterclass at BFC. Alex did a really fantastic job on it. I'll link that in the show notes for anyone who hasn't seen it. We do have a fly tying masterclass. I think it's pretty obvious, though, that YouTube is the go-to. That's where you want to go. YouTube University. That's a great place for fly tying instruction. So that'll tell you, what flies to tie. And then any video that's actually worth your time to watch is going to have a materials list, or sometimes they'll call it a fly recipe, somewhere either in the description of the video, or maybe it's on their website, but they'll have that. My personal favorite is Tightline Productions with Tim Flagler. His tying videos are just fantastic. They're very easy to follow along. He's got a great way of explaining some of the more complex techniques we use in fly tying. Really good video angles. The video quality is great. The flies are never out of focus, or it's not too grainy. I can always see what's going on. The audio is good. It's not like awkward. I hear him breathing behind the fly. I've seen some videos like that where it's, and then it's like they're Darth Vader. I'm gonna wrap the elk hair. I can't even do it, but you know what? I'm sure you've seen some videos like that where it's just a little awkward to watch, and I'll quit doing it to spare you all the awkwardness. And then Tim will also usually give some history to the fly. He's got good music. It's not overwhelming or distracting. It's just a really well-produced video. I've learned a ton from Tim. His stuff's just awesome. I love it. Fly Fish Food does a great job on their tying videos as well. Some funny stuff, usually a lot of good jokes, not taking it too seriously, just having a good time. I also really love Davey McPhail. He's probably the best tyer for more of the traditional wet fly style patterns. And he's over there. Davey's criminy. Is it Scotland or Ireland? And I know there's a difference. I just can't remember which one he's from right now. I'm blanking on it. I think he's from Scotland. But Davey does some fantastic stuff on his YouTube channel as well. Avid Max does some good stuff. I enjoy their videos. And then Charlie Craven, can't leave him off the list. He's got some great videos. Charlie's another one of those folks who's just a really good teacher and really good at explaining why things are done a certain way, or why he uses the materials that he does. He's just very gifted in that regard. And then the other thing that I would mention here is definitely look for some older fly tying books. They usually don't have the best pictures, but they've often got some really interesting old school patterns that don't get fished very much anymore. And I think these flies are actually kind of killer. The Renegade dry fly would be an example, or even the Prince nymph. I was actually talking with Alex about this the other day. I don't think the Prince gets the love it deserves anymore. I think it's kind of an old school fly. And I don't know very many folks who fish them regularly. So if you fish Prince nymphs regularly, let me know, because I'm curious if people are actually doing it, or if it's just, I don't know anybody who fishes them. But yeah, the Renegade, the Prince, even the Picket pin, that's a really old school pattern. But they're really fun to tie. They can be very effective, and they're like, again, there's just the cool history aspect of it. I enjoy that part. But you will find a lot of those in these older books. I've got a couple on the shelf here behind me. Jack Dennis's Western Trout Flies, volumes 1 and 2. They're really great books, as are any of Tom Rosenbauer's tying books as well. So pick up a book. You never know what you might find in there. And yes, that's the English teacher in me coming out, but I'm a retired English teacher, so I'm not throwing it down on you too much. So hopefully that helps, Jordan. I appreciate the question. Thanks. Chase from Missouri has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey guys, I just watched the podcast on planning a fly trip. I've been thinking about taking a solo trip this summer in late July. I have never fished up north and would love to go for steelhead. Do y'all have any suggestions about high-yield river systems for a beginner fly fisher like me? Ideally, the closest fishery to the Kansas City area where I'd leave from. I'm just some broke college kid who wants to get on gnarly steelhead. I have no problem roughing it. I'd actually prefer that. I plan on camping and hiking to remote places that aren't fished often. I would really appreciate any suggestions of rivers to consider. Love all the work y'all do. Keep it up." Chase, you've got an interesting question here, and thank you so much for the compliments. I appreciate it. First thing, steelhead aren't really something to target during the summer. They're more of a fall and winter fish than and an early spring fish as well. So you're going to be out of season for them if you're up there in July. Your best bet, and by going up north, I assume you mean fishing up near the Great Lakes or maybe up in Canada. If you want to go for a steelhead that run out of the Great Lakes, which I know we talked about rainbow trout for the open of the episode. There are steelhead that have been planted in the Great Lakes, even though they're freshwater. They're still genetically steelhead. They run out of the lakes, spawn in the rivers, go back to the lakes. And there's a whole debate about whether or not they're actually steelhead. We're not going to get into that. But if you want to go for Great Lakes steelhead, right now is a fantastic time to be up there. Or honestly, February is a great time to get up there as well for Great Lakes steelhead. I caught my first and my only Great Lakes steelhead in February a couple of years ago. It was a very memorable, just incredible fish. So you may want to change up your expectations. Steelhead just really aren't going to be on the menu for you in your timetable. Now, second, I understand. I really do how overwhelming it can feel when you are looking for a place to go fish, especially if you're looking to travel, because you're going to put the time and the money into it. You want the payoff, right? But I also know that I would never feel comfortable getting behind the mic on this show and giving out specific places to go fly fish, other than saying something like earlier, I gave out the Yakima River example. It's not a secret. It's very well known. Me talking about it is not going to dramatically increase the crowds there. Same thing with like the Fire Hole or the San Juan or the Madison. We all know about these places. Me mentioning it isn't going to have an impact one way or the other on who's fishing there. And I really try to be very careful with naming rivers. We never name the rivers that we fish in our videos, except I think maybe the Green in Utah, because again, there's no secret, because we don't ever want to add to the crowds in the river. I don't want to do that. It's a delicate balance because I don't want to keep you from finding a place to fish. And I'm not trying to tell you, don't ask, because that's how you learn things, but it's all about the right settings to ask things in, I think. So I don't want to keep anybody from finding a place to fish. I'd love, for us all to have our little honey holes that we've found and go up there. I want folks to have that experience because it's amazing. Finding a place and going there is just fantastic. So I know how much it hurts to hear about a fishery that's a little more out of the way, that doesn't get a lot of crowds, how much it hurts to hear that name dropped on a podcast or to read about it in a magazine article. I've just never felt comfortable doing that. And I've really tried to not do it as much as possible throughout my career. So I'm never going to to get on the mic here and tell you, yeah, go fish here. Because in addition to worrying about adding to the crowds, there's also the fact that I think when you get handed a spot, when someone just tells you, go fish here, do this, it takes away from the adventure. And it doesn't feel as sweet as it could otherwise. And I'll tell you a couple of stories to illustrate this point. Years ago, I was back in high school, and my next door neighbor told me this story about the big stream. That's what he called it. And it was this piece of water. It was like an hour away from town. And I wasn't exactly sure where, but he talked this thing up all the time about how when he was in high school, he rode horses to get to it, and the fishing was just outstanding. So we finally planned a trip. We walked in one weekend to go fish the big stream. And by walked, I mean we hiked literally up and over a ridge to get down into the big stream. And it was as amazing as he told me. It lived up to the billing. We fished it hard. We caught some great fish. And my buddy caught one of the biggest browns I'd ever seen in my life to that point. It was just incredible. Just so cool to be there. And then, of course, I start going back as often as I could, and I fish the absolute snot out of it, and I still fish it pretty consistently whenever I go back to Utah. So that's one example. A few years after that, I heard about this brook trout lake down in central Utah that had enormous brookies in it. I'd seen pictures. We're talking brook trout that were in the 5 to 6 pound range, legitimately big trophy-sized brook trout. And you needed a float tube to fish it properly. And I finally convinced a buddy of mine to spill the beans on where it was. He told me about it, and he said, all right, I'll take you. So we hiked in as early in the season as we could. We had to bust through some snow drifts to get there. And I actually caught a really nice brookie. It was my biggest ever to that point, on like my third or fourth cast. And then I didn't catch anything the rest of the day, but I caught the big brook trout that I came for. And I used to really just fish that lake religiously. Almost during the summer, I was down there almost once a week. I would fish it just all the time. But I haven't been there in 6 or 7 years, maybe even longer. Honestly, it's kind of sad now that I think about it. I want to go back there. Now, the fish I caught out of the big stream and out of the brookie pond, they were awesome. They were amazing. I would not trade those experiences for anything because I learned a ton from both places. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I was driving from one lake to another. It was early spring, maybe a month or so after this time of year. I was looking for open water to fish during ice off. And I came up over this mountain pass and drove down through a canyon that I'd only been in maybe once or twice before in my life. I just never really driven that way to get to where I was going. Took it because it's a scenic route. Let's have some fun. And I get down into this canyon. I see this tiny little stream off to my right. And I mean little. I think it was like 6 feet wide at its biggest. So naturally, I'm curious. I pull over and I look at the water and I can see a bunch of midges hatching. Literally, there's this one column of sunlight, and then the midges are just hatching in that. So it looks like they're highlighted from on high, right? It was a sign. It's kind of what it looked like. And I told myself, if I see a fish rise, I'll fish it. And then within like 30 seconds, I saw a fish rise. So I grabbed my fly rod, and I spent the next 4 hours just fishing and catching more cutthroat than I could count out of this tiny little stream that I discovered all on my own. I literally just lucked into it, found this stream, and I had one of the best days of fishing I've ever had. It really is one of the best days, still top 5 for me, because it was so unique and cool. And I found this place on my own. Those cutthroat, they weren't very big either. They were small. The fish was small, but those fish were so much more meaningful and enjoyable to me than a lot of the fish I caught out of the big stream or the brookie pond, because no one showed me where to go and what to do. I found that on my own. I got lucky. Yeah, I got lucky finding it, but I still found it on my own. I still took the time to get off and it was literally pull off the road and look at it. The bare minimum that you have to do, I did that, and I had this kind of incredible experience with it. So again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with asking for suggestions of places to go and fish, but as someone who still very closely resembles a broke college student, at least financially, I promise, there's quite a bit more enjoyment that you're going to get out of just poking around a place and discovering this information on your own. There's a lot more you're going to gain from it by doing research online or looking at old forums and looking at stocking and harvest reports and spending time on Google Maps. You can put together a really solid game plan with all of those resources that won't lead you astray all that often. And then when you put this plan to the test, you go there, you catch a fish, you've done it on your own. It's just this amazing feeling of adventure that you managed to pull that off, that you managed to do something all on your own, something that not a lot of other people do in the grand scheme of things. It's just a unique accomplishment. I mean, shoot, Alex and I are in the middle of doing this for a trip that we're tentatively planning right now. For bull trout, we're looking at different areas that we want to go fish, places where the bull trout should be, and we're planning on spending quite a few days looking for those fish. We could hire a guide, and we could just go right into the fish and get into them, but that takes the adventure out of it. We want to go have that experience of finding those big fish. So the really long answer to your question, again, I'm never going to get on the show and give out specific directions of where to go fish. There is so much more enjoyment that you are going to get out of finding a place yourself than if you just listen to some random guy drinking Diet Coke in Wyoming who tells you where to go. So hopefully that helps. I really appreciate you sending the question in. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the Q&A section of this week's show, but don't go anywhere because the Live Your Life moment is coming right up. Every week, we end the show by sharing a story and pictures from folks who are out there on the water living real life. We love to hear about your adventures, to see the pictures of you guys out there on the water fishing and enjoying yourselves. So if you've got a live real life moment and some pictures that you would like to share, you can go ahead and submit those at the link in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Connor. Writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer and Alex, love the show. I've recently gotten into fly fishing in the past year. My dad was an avid fisherman and he passed away last year. After his passing, I have fully dived into the realm of fly fishing to honor his memory. This adventure was a couple of weeks ago. My wife, 2 dogs, and I hiked 4 miles up to a beautiful alpine lake in northern Idaho. After lugging water, snacks, a rod, a net, and sometimes my smaller dog up the mountain, I finally got set up to cast into my first alpine lake. I saw that there were smaller mayflies hitting the water that the trout were rising for. I followed the match the hatch lesson and tied on the smallest mayfly I had. I cast and got skunked for the next hour. I finally stopped and decided I needed to sit back and really watch the water. By taking this break, I was able to see that the trout were actually going for the dragonflies that were hitting the surface every once in a while. I tied on the one dragonfly imitation I had and almost immediately tied up with a beautiful cutthroat. It was the first time I had ever caught a cutthroat, let alone caught a fish on an alpine lake. I wanted to share this and say thank you for what you guys do over adventures. Your masterclass videos and podcasts have helped me start the fly fishing journey." Connor, that is freaking fantastic. Actually, that gets a freaking fantastic out of me. Love the story. Love the perseverance. Love that you got to share that with your wife and your 2 dogs. And love what you're doing to honor your dad's memory. That really is something special when you have the opportunity to do that. So really just tip of the hat to you for sticking with it, getting into it, and sounds like you've been bit pretty hard by the bug. So congrats and welcome to the club, man. Thank you so much. This is the kind of story that, we talk all day about, all sorts of different fly fishing stuff, but this is the stuff that really, really keeps me coming back to fly fishing, is these kinds of experiences. And to hear about them from y'all is just fantastic. It's a wonderful thing. So thank you so much, Connor. I appreciate you. And with that, folks, we're going to end the show this week. Thank you so much for listening to the whole thing. It really helps us out. And if you want to help us out even more, you can go ahead and rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can reach and help them live a real life. And speaking of living real life, get out on the water this week. The weather's great, finally. Go catch some fish, have an awesome time, and until next week, everybody, live real life.